There's a moment that doesn't look dramatic from the outside. No shouting, no final argument, no big scene. But inside, something shifts. You stop explaining yourself. You stop chasing clarity. You stop trying to fix what never felt stable to begin with. And that's the moment she feels it. Not because you said anything, but because your energy changed. And if you've been in a relationship with a narcissistic woman, you know how much everything revolved around energy, your attention, your reactions, your effort. So when that disappears, it doesn't go unnoticed. At first, you probably thought the problem was you. You thought maybe you were too sensitive. Maybe you asked for too much. Maybe you just didn't understand her the right way. Because that's what it felt like. Confusing, unstable, always shifting. One day she was warm, engaged, almost perfect. The next day, distant, cold, hard to reach. And every time that shift happened, you adjusted yourself. You tried to be more patient, more understanding, more careful with your words. You thought if you just got it right, things would stay good. But they never stayed good for long. And that's because the dynamic wasn't built on mutual connection. It was built on control. Not obvious control, not loud or aggressive, subtle control. The kind that keeps you emotionally invested while slowly making you question your own reality. She didn't need to dominate you outright. She just needed to stay unpredictable enough that you kept trying, that you stayed engaged, that you didn't walk away. Because as long as you were trying, she was in control. That's the role you were placed in. The one who fixes, the one who explains, the one who keeps the connection alive. And over time, that role becomes exhausting. Not all at once, gradually. You start noticing how one-sided things feel, how your needs are always secondary, how every conversation somehow turns back to her feelings, her perspective, her version of events. Even when you're hurt, even when something clearly affected you, it gets redirected, minimized, dismissed, or turned into something you did wrong. And for a while, you stay in that cycle because you remember the good moments, the version of her that felt real, present, connected. You keep thinking that version will come back if you just hold on a little longer. But eventually, something inside you starts to wake up. You begin to see the pattern, not just the behavior, but the repetition of it. The way every conflict follows the same structure. The way your feelings never fully land. The way accountability never really happens. And that awareness changes things. You don't react the same way anymore. You don't chase the same answers. You stop trying to force understanding where there isn't any. And this is where the shift begins. Because for the first time, you're stepping out of the role she relied on you to play. You're no longer feeding the dynamic. You're no longer holding it together on your side. And that's when she starts to feel it. At first, it's subtle. She might test you, reach out casually, act like nothing happened, bring back a familiar tone, a familiar energy, because she expects you to respond the way you always have. She expects you to re-engage. But when you don't, when your responses are calm, neutral, or even absent, that's when it starts to register. Something is different. You're not reacting. You're not chasing. You're not trying to pull her back in. And for someone who is used to being the emotional center of the dynamic, that shift is unsettling. Because the control was never about dominance. It was about influence. Your emotional investment was the foundation of that influence. And now it's fading. That's the moment she knows she's losing you. Not when you leave, not when you say goodbye, but when you emotionally detach. Because leaving can still come with emotion. It can still come with anger, frustration, even longing. And all of that is still engagement. But detachment is quiet. It doesn't argue. It doesn't explain. It doesn't try to be understood. It simply steps back, And that's something she can't easily pull back in. So what happens next? It depends on how much control she feels she's losing. In some cases, she tries to re-engage more directly. You might see a sudden shift back to warmth, more attention, more interest, even apologies that feel different than before. But if you look closely, it's not about understanding you. It's about restoring the dynamic. She senses that you're slipping away, so she adjusts her behavior just enough to pull you back in. And if you respond emotionally to that, if you reopen that door, the cycle starts again. Not because anything has changed at the core, but because the structure of control has been restored. In other cases, the reaction is different. Instead of pulling you in, she distances herself further, becomes colder, more dismissive, acts like she doesn't care. And this can feel confusing, because just when you're pulling away, she seems even more detached. But this isn't indifference, it's protection. If she can convince herself that you don't matter, then losing control doesn't feel like a loss. It feels like a choice. And sometimes there's a third response, one that feels more intense. Sudden emotional reactions, frustration, accusations, blaming you for changing, telling you that you're distant now, that you've become different. And in a way, you have, but not in the way she frames it. You've become aware. You've stepped out of the role that kept the dynamic going. And that disrupts everything. Because the relationship was never balanced. It relied on you giving more than you received. On you staying engaged even when things didn't make sense. So when that stops, the imbalance becomes visible. Not just to you, but to her as well. And that visibility creates tension. Because now the dynamic can't continue the way it used to. This is the part where many people get pulled back in. Because the shift creates discomfort. You might start questioning yourself again, wondering if you're being too cold, too distant, too closed off. You might feel the urge to explain, to soften your stance, to go back to how things were, just to ease that tension. But this is where clarity matters. Because what you're feeling isn't wrong. It's unfamiliar. You've spent so much time being emotionally available in a one-sided way that stepping back feels unnatural. But unnatural doesn't mean incorrect. It means new. And that new space is where your control returns. Not control over her, but control over yourself. Your time, your energy, your emotional boundaries. And this is where real change begins. Not in trying to fix the relationship, but in stepping out of a pattern that was never working for you. Because the truth is, the moment she realizes she's losing you isn't about her. It's about you. It's about the point where you stop abandoning yourself to keep something going, where you stop negotiating your needs just to maintain connection, where you start choosing clarity over confusion. And that choice has consequences, not always easy ones. You might feel guilt. You might feel doubt. You might even miss the connection, even if it wasn't healthy. That's normal, because you weren't attached to the dysfunction. You were attached to the moments that felt real, the moments that gave you hope. And letting go of that hope takes time. But here's what matters. You're no longer stuck in the cycle. You're no longer reacting automatically. You're seeing things as they are, not as you wished they could be. And that awareness gives you something you didn't have before. Choice. You can choose how much you engage. You can choose what you respond to. You can choose when to step back. And those choices shift the entire dynamic. Not because she changes, but because you do. And when you stay consistent in that shift, something else happens. The pull weakens. The need to figure things out fades. The emotional intensity that once kept you hooked starts to settle. You begin to feel more grounded, more stable, more clear in your own perspective. And that clarity is what allows you to move forward, not in a reactive way, but in a calm, steady way. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to explain your decision. You don't need her to understand in order for it to be valid. Because your experience was real. Your confusion was real. Your exhaustion was real. And stepping out of that isn't something you need to justify. It's something you need to protect. So if you're in that moment right now, where you feel the shift, where you're pulling back, where things don't feel the same anymore, understand what's happening. You're not losing something meaningful. You're seeing something clearly. And clarity can feel uncomfortable at first, but it's also what creates peace. Not instant peace, but real peace. The kind that doesn't depend on someone else's behavior. The kind that isn't constantly being disrupted. And as you stay in that space, as you continue to choose yourself, that peace becomes stronger, more stable, more natural. Until one day, you realize something simple. You're no longer waiting. You're no longer analyzing every interaction. You're no longer trying to make sense of something that never fully made sense. You've stepped out, not just physically, but emotionally. And that's the moment everything changes. Not for her, but for you. And that's what actually matters.